Rick Chiarelli is a longtime councillor here in Ottawa. Part of the discussion today was about the issue of Uber, and this is something you've been hearing from your constituents about. What was the decision of Ottawa City Council? It wasn't to shut Uber down, but not exactly something that's going to make the taxi industry that happy, is it?
Well, no, what we're going to do is we're going to be moving ahead with a 10-month study on the future of taxis and the regulations associated with driving people for money between destinations. And also, in the interim, bylaw staff have committed to stepping up the charges and investigations.
Why step up the charges and investigations? This is a service that the public actually likes. Unlike so often the taxi industry, they have bad experiences with it. People generally, when I hear about it, have good experiences with Uber.
Well, okay, first of all, we have a regulated system. So we've accepted long ago in this country that when you have a regulated system, the regulations apply to everybody. You don't get to opt out of regulation. I had a woman in my ward who was operating a business out of her house where she performed nose jobs, facelifts, and other operations. And she had never been to medical school. But she had honed her craft by watching YouTube.
That's what you claimed?
Yes. So the idea that she could operate without a medical license flies in the face of regulations that we have in place for very good reason. And so she wasn't allowed to continue operating. The same is true of any business where the government goes in and regulates. You're regulating for health and safety reasons usually, and you're doing so in a way to protect the public. And it only works if the regulations apply to everybody and people aren't free to opt out of the regulations. So in this review, we're going to look at all of the regulations associated with taxis and say, do we still want these protections or do we not? So some of them are things like, if you're a taxi driver, you have to take a course at Algonquin College on how to be a taxi driver and what is expected of you. Do we think drivers should still have that? If they should, then if Uber is ever permitted in Ottawa, then certainly their drivers should have to do it too. Others are the age of the vehicle. So if we say for taxis, vehicles cannot exceed 10 years of age, should that same standard apply to Uber? Well,
I think they already have that in their system.
They have that in their system, but it would apply in regulation. And then we have other things. We have the mandatory video cameras in taxis. Is that necessary? If so, then presumably you would want Uber drivers to do the same thing. So once we sort out what protections really are still of value and still should be in place, then we can talk about whether Uber should be able to apply equally with taxis to get a license. And that's another debate, but the first step is to see what protections we still want in place and still want to regulate.
Is this 10-month study partially just punting the ball downfield because you know that Toronto recently lost in court? They challenged Uber, they tried to shut it down, and the judge said, no, this doesn't apply. They're not operating an illegal taxi service. Does this buy you time while that works its way through the system?
No, actually, the couple of issues here. First of all, the decision to move into the review is actually the newer kind of decision, because otherwise we would just be reinforcing the existing law. So the fact that we're doing a review is a step that I think Uber would like, because it opens up the possibility that they could one day apply to operate legally. Secondly, the decision in Toronto was trial level judge. So in the stare decisis system, it's not binding precedent on anyone. It applies only to that case with those circumstances in that location. So unless there's an appeal, we won't have any decision that can guide the rest of the province. So we're not even paying attention to that right now, because we do know we have dozens and dozens and dozens of convictions against Uber drivers where some have made the same sorts of arguments. And so we have dozens and dozens of judge decisions saying that are upholding the current regulations. I think the long-term view in this is the technology's changed things. It's illuminated some shortfalls in the taxi system. It's created myths. There's a myth that by having Uber operate, you could drive down the price of taxis. Well, that's false, because the city council set the taxi fares, not the market.
But is that the job of city council, to set the taxi fare, to have this medallion system that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a taxi license?
Well, if it had been my choice, city council would not be setting taxi fares. It was ridiculous last time when the union and the taxi companies were out here to try to stop a taxi fare increase, and city council imposed it on them. I don't understand that, but so one of the things we might want to get out of is actually setting the rates, okay? And so that's will be part of the review. But the point is, if we examine all this, we'll see, probably to the surprise of many Uber enthusiasts, there are a lot of regulations that we really do want to keep, that provide service to us and protection if there's any kind of incident in the cab.
You sound like you're going the middle road, though. You're saying that there are regulations to keep, but also that there's regulations you might want to get rid of.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I think well, I'm not allowed to prejudge it, but I think we need to look seriously at whether we should still be setting taxi rates as a city council and not let the market do some of that. And if you have the same requirements on everybody who's operating, then the market's free and can operate.
The regulations that I truly understand revolve around safety, like making sure that cars are safe, that the brakes work. Mm-hmm. But when I arrived in Ottawa, those regulations existed in the taxis, and I quickly learned that I was taking my life in my hand getting into a taxi in this city. That was the days before the current owner of Coventry Connections, the main cab company, Hanif Patney, took over. Yeah. And he improved it. So it was his steps and not city regulations that really improved the taxi system so that I felt safe getting in a cab.
Yeah, well, it is a lot better now than it was before that first reform, and Mr. Patney did a lot to do that, and so did the city. But we may have over-regulated. We will see if that's the case. The thing is, because people are so used to the regulation, you have people, a lot of young people, teenagers in early 20s, getting in Uber cabs, expecting that they are just as protected as if they were in a taxi. And we get the fallout from that. We get the people phoning us saying, they charged me twice what I thought I was getting charged. What are you going to do about it? Well, you're in a system outside the regulated system. You took your chance. There's nothing we can do. We had a guy who was he took an Uber to visit a friend in Carp, and 3 a.m. rolls around, and he tries to get Uber to pick him up again, and apparently they wouldn't do that because he had achieved a bad feedback rating.
So the driver, just like you can essentially blackball a driver from picking you up again if you give them bad feedback, they can give the passenger bad feedback.
Yeah, so apparently he earned bad feedback, and that's a disturbing thing to discover when you're in Carp.
Which is, for people that don't know Carp, it's well outside the bus routes. Where do you think this is? Where do you think this is going to go? Do you see the city getting to the day where they say, we're going to regulate for safety, but we're not going to have this system where people are running their mortgages off of the fact that they have a taxi license?
Well, I think it's a bigger question, because back when Marshall McLuhan was talking about communications and predicted the internet, he also talked about as new media would come in, people would assume that new media meant new world and no laws applied, okay? And that that the process to reconciling the law with the new media would be a greater appreciation of why you had law in the first place. So what I'm hoping is, in the taxi industry, taxi study, we're going to sit down, we're going to see those things that are still valuable, and people are going to say, hey, you know what? It's a real good thing we have these rules in place. And we're going to see some rules that look ridiculous, like council telling the taxis you must raise your fares, and the taxis saying they don't want to. And if we sort through that, we'll probably end up at a really good place. But we have to establish a principle in the country that just because there's an app that lets you do something to avoid regulation, that doesn't mean you legally can avoid regulation.
All right, Rick, it doesn't sound like you're making either side happy, but fun talking as always.
Okay, thanks.